It was a cold, foggy morning in Crescent Grove, a small town nestled along California's quiet coastline. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone and where secrets were hard to keep. But in 2005, a dark secret was buried deep within the town, one that would haunt its residents for years to come. Lena Rivers, a beloved local teacher and mother of two, had been found dead in her home. A brutal murder that left the small, tight-knit community shaken to its core. The investigation, despite all the effort poured into it, had gone cold. No suspects, no witnesses, just a crime that seemed impossible to solve. By 2020, it had faded from the public's mind, relegated to the status of a tragic, unsolved case. But for the detectives involved and for Lena's heartbroken family, it was never truly forgotten. That morning, Detective Marcus Doyle, now a seasoned investigator with graying hair and the weight of countless unsolved cases on his shoulders, received the call that would change everything. His phone buzzed on the desk with a number he didn't recognize. When he picked it up, the voice on the other end was calm but urgent. "We've got a match. The DNA from Lena Rivers' case, it's come through. We've got a suspect." Detective Doyle's heart skipped a beat. The weight of the words hit him immediately. It had been over 15 years since Lena's body had been found lying cold in her bedroom, her life tragically cut short by a killer who had walked free for too long. A cold case no more. This was a moment that would send shockwaves through the town of Crescent Grove once the news spread. As news spread, the quiet streets of Crescent Grove erupted in disbelief. How could it be? After all these years, someone had finally been linked to the crime? Lena Rivers, her smile still fresh in the minds of those who had known her, had never truly left the town's collective memory. But now there was hope. There was justice. Lena's sister, Maya Rivers, had spent the years since the murder fighting for answers, never able to let go of the pain. She stood outside the local diner, a crowd gathering around her as reporters swarmed. Her voice trembled with emotion. "All I ever wanted was for my sister's killer to be brought to justice. I've waited years to hear this. But it doesn't feel real. It's like a dream." At location of crime, the house where Lena had been found lifeless in her bed, a vigil was held as residents gathered to pray, reflect, and share memories. It was hard for anyone to look at the house without thinking of the horror that had unfolded behind its walls. The place, once a home filled with love and laughter, had become a symbol of loss. For Detective Marcus Doyle, this was the moment he'd been waiting for, but the years of frustration weighed heavily on him. When Lena's case had first come across his desk, it had seemed solvable. But with every passing month, it became a more distant memory, one he could not fully shake. There had been so many dead ends. And now, after years of silence, this break in the case, this discovery, was a bittersweet reminder of how long the town had been in the dark. This is more than just a case, Marcus thought to himself as he prepared to investigate further. This is about giving these people closure, about showing them that justice isn't always swift, but it does come. The news of the arrest would come soon, and Marcus knew the town wasn't ready for what was to come next. A killer, living among them for years, someone they might have seen every day, was about to be exposed. As the phone call ended, Detective Doyle felt the weight of responsibility settle upon his shoulders. The lead had come through, but there were still many questions to answer. Who was the suspect? What did they know? How had this person eluded the police for so long? And what would the fallout be when the truth was finally revealed? The town of Crescent Grove once again was holding its breath. But this time, they wouldn't have to wait much longer for the answers they had been longing for. The truth, as painful as it might be, was about to come to light. The evening of March 15, 2005, in Crescent Grove was nothing out of the ordinary. The fog from the ocean had rolled in, clinging to the quiet streets as the town settled into its usual lull. There was no indication that by dawn, the community would be irrevocably changed by a crime so brutal that it would remain unsolved for years. Lena Rivers, a 32-year-old high school teacher at Crescent Grove High, had just returned home from a long day of teaching. Known for her warmth, her bright smile, and her dedication to her students, Lena was the kind of person everyone admired. She lived in a modest but charming two-story house on Cypress Lane, not far from the local school. It was a house full of life, but on that particular night, it was eerily quiet. Lena's husband, Tom Rivers, had been away on a business trip. Their two children, Ella and Lucas, were staying with her mother in a neighboring town for the weekend. Lena had planned to spend the evening catching up on work and perhaps enjoying a quiet dinner alone. Little did she know that someone was already waiting in the shadows, prepared to bring her life to an untimely end. Around 10:15 p.m., Lena made her way upstairs to her bedroom. She had just sent a few final emails to her students and locked the front door before heading to bed. Her house was surrounded by trees, the leaves rustling faintly in the wind. The thick fog outside made it feel as if the world beyond her front door didn't exist, an isolating feeling that would only intensify as the night unfolded. What happened next was a blur, an unknown struggle between Lena and an intruder who had found his way into her home. Police would later conclude that there was no sign of forced entry, leading them to believe that Lena might have known the person who killed her, or that the intruder had been let in under some pretext. The fact that there were no screams, no signs of a struggle downstairs, made the entire crime even more unsettling. Lena was found in her bed, the sheets stained with blood. Her body had been posed deliberately, a chilling indication that the killer had a twisted sense of control over her life and death. The crime was swift but calculated. The coroner's report showed that Lena had been strangled, the marks on her neck indicating the strength with which her life was taken. There was no sign of sexual assault, no theft, nothing that pointed to a typical robbery gone wrong. The case had baffled investigators from the start. Why would someone murder Lena? What was the motive? Who could want to hurt a woman so well loved by her family, friends, and students? Detective Marcus Doyle was one of the first responders to the scene. When he arrived, he was met with the somber faces of uniformed officers, already combing through the house for evidence. The victim's body was already covered, but the unsettling sight of her bedroom, her sanctuary, left an indelible mark on him. It was as if the walls themselves had absorbed the horror that had unfolded there. It didn't make sense, Marcus later recalled. Lena wasn't the type of person to have enemies. She was a beloved teacher, a devoted mother. Who would want to hurt her? The initial investigation led to few concrete leads. There were no fingerprints on the weapon, a simple silk scarf that had been used to strangle her. No signs of a forced entry. Neighbors reported hearing nothing unusual, and Lena's phone records revealed no calls of significance the night of the murder. The only oddity was the fact that Lena had spent her last moments alone, quietly preparing for bed, seemingly unaware of the danger lurking just a few feet away. Despite these early dead ends, Detective Doyle refused to let the case go cold. He and his team conducted interviews with everyone who might have known Lena, the teachers at Crescent Grove High, her neighbors, and the people she worked with. But no one could provide anything definitive. The case began to feel more and more like a ghost, untouchable, a reminder of what was lost but with no answers to grasp. Back at the Rivers household, Tom and Lena's children were living in the kind of pain no family should endure. Tom, devastated by his wife's death and his absence during the crucial moments, struggled with guilt. But more than that, he couldn't make sense of it. Why had this happened? Why was Lena taken away from him, from their children, from the community? Lena's sister, Maya Rivers, became the spokesperson for the family. She was the one who spoke to reporters and kept the pressure on authorities to keep looking for answers. But even she couldn't understand what had happened. Lena was everything to us, she said in one interview. She didn't deserve this. We just want to know why. As time passed, the case started to slip out of the public eye. Crescent Grove moved on, the memory of Lena's murder slowly fading into the background. But not for the Rivers family. Not for Detective Doyle. Not for the people who loved Lena. The ghost of her unsolved murder lingered in the town, and the question remained, who killed Lena Rivers? And more importantly, why? The weeks following Lena Rivers' death were filled with frantic searching. Detective Marcus Doyle, along with his team, worked tirelessly to unravel the mystery. Each day, new leads surfaced, but each one seemed to lead them further from the truth. The quiet town of Crescent Grove was suddenly under a magnifying glass, as the public demanded answers, but there were few to give. The first person of interest was Tom Rivers, Lena's husband. After all, it was he who stood to gain the most, financially and emotionally, should anything happen to Lena. Yet, despite his obvious grief, some found his behavior unusual. He had been out of town on business the night of the murder, but Detective Doyle wasn't ready to rule him out. There was no clear alibi, and Tom had returned to town almost immediately after hearing the news of his wife's death. However, after multiple interviews with Tom, it became clear that he was devastated by the loss of his wife. There was no evidence of him being involved in her death, and no apparent motive. As Detective Doyle dug deeper into Tom's background, he found nothing that linked him to the crime. Tom was a man who had been in a long-distance marriage due to his work, but his relationship with Lena appeared solid, with no sign of animosity or jealousy that might lead to such a heinous act. In the quiet suburb where Lena lived, the neighbors were the next to be interviewed. A few claimed to have heard a strange noise around 10:30 p.m. on the night of the murder, a soft thud followed by silence. Some thought they had heard the faint sound of a car starting in the distance, but no one could provide a solid description of a vehicle or any suspicious figures lurking around the house. Detective Doyle found himself questioning the neighbors over and over again. Could someone have seen something in the days leading up to the murder? Did Lena have any enemies? The neighbors spoke highly of her. She was well-liked, always cheerful, and seemingly content with her life. Yet they couldn't shake the feeling that something about that night wasn't right. One neighbor, Clara Jenkins, reported seeing a car parked near Lena's house on the night of the murder. However, Clara was not certain of the make or model of the car, and no one else corroborated her account. The possibility of an unknown visitor, someone with no connection to the town, only deepened the mystery. Despite the early lack of clear suspects, the investigation pressed on. Crime scene investigators scoured Lena's home for any physical evidence that might lead to a breakthrough. A search of her bedroom revealed nothing but the bloody sheets and signs of a struggle. There were no fingerprints, no sign of forced entry. The strangulation was methodical, almost as if the killer had known exactly what they were doing. DNA evidence was collected, and a partial sample of the victim's blood was sent to the lab for testing. But the results came back with no match to anyone in the national database. The killer's DNA was clean, no criminal history to track, no past to follow. The trail felt colder by the day. Detective Doyle focused next on Lena's personal life, hoping to uncover something hidden beneath the surface. She had been a teacher at Crescent Grove High, and there was a small group of students who were close to her. Yet, none of them seemed to have a motive to hurt her. The teachers at the school spoke highly of Lena, describing her as an exemplary role model. No conflicts, no complaints. Doyle even reached out to Lena's former colleagues at a nearby university where she had completed her master's degree. There was a brief rumor about an old acquaintance, a former classmate, but the lead turned out to be nothing more than hearsay. Months passed. The case seemed to be slipping through their fingers. Without new evidence or a solid suspect, Detective Doyle found himself growing frustrated. He reviewed the case files over and over, but the questions remained unanswered. Who killed Lena Rivers? And why? The town too began to move on. The investigation, though still active, had lost its grip on the community's attention. People returned to their routines and the media coverage dwindled. Lena's murder, once the focal point of every conversation in Crescent Grove, was now just another tragic memory. But for those who truly cared, the pain never went away. For Maya Rivers, Lena's sister, the pain of losing her sibling was compounded by the lack of closure. She attended every police briefing hoping for any new information, but each meeting ended with the same frustrating outcome: no answers. Maya became an unofficial advocate for the case, contacting local newspapers, speaking to anyone who would listen, hoping to reignite interest in the investigation. But as the years went on, Maya found herself facing an agonizing truth: the case might never be solved. I've spent nights hoping for something, anything, that would bring us closer to the truth, Maya said in a heart-wrenching interview. But I don't know how much longer we can wait. For Detective Doyle, the case haunted him in ways he hadn't expected. With each passing month, it became more difficult to keep his resolve. The unsolved case began to feel like an invisible weight on his shoulders, an unfinished chapter he couldn't put down. He had solved many cases, but Lena's death felt different, more personal, more painful. In his quiet moments, Doyle would stare at the evidence board in his office. The same pictures of Lena, the same map of Crescent Grove, the same list of suspects with nothing to connect them to the crime. Every time he thought he had an answer, it slipped away like sand through his fingers. As the years went by, Crescent Grove returned to its quiet existence. The memories of Lena Rivers' murder still lingered in the air, but they slowly faded from the minds of the townspeople. The case had grown cold, the questions unanswered. It was as if time itself had settled over the town like the fog rolling off the coast, dense, suffocating, and impossible to shake off. For Maya Rivers, the silence was unbearable. Each year, the anniversary of Lena's death brought a fresh wave of pain. The town had moved on, but Maya was trapped in the past, clinging to the hope that one day, someone would remember Lena's story and finally bring her killer to justice. Yet as the years passed, that hope began to fade. Every morning, Maya would go through the case files once more. She would read through the reports, the interviews, the witness statements, hoping that one day something would jump out at her, something that would lead to a breakthrough. But each time it was the same. No new evidence. No new leads. Just the same unanswered questions. I've lost count of the number of times I've stared at those pictures, hoping to find something I missed, Maya would say in the rare moments when she spoke about the case. but it's like staring at a wall hoping it will speak back. For Detective Marcus Doyle, the case weighed just as heavily. He had solved many cases in his career, but none had left such a lasting impression on him. Lena Rivers had been a simple murder in the beginning, but over time, it had become a personal struggle. He could not shake the image of her bright eyes, her warmth, her potential snuffed out in a quiet town. He couldn't forget her family, especially Maya, who still showed up at his office year after year, asking the same question. Have you found anything? Is there any hope? Doyle had tried everything. He brought in forensic experts, revisited old witness statements, even sent the evidence to new labs for re-examination. But the results were always the same. Nothing. He had poured his heart into the case, but now, as the years passed, the investigation had become a distant memory for his colleagues and a lost cause for most of the town. The case had slipped from the public eye. No more media coverage, no more fresh tips. Even the local police department had moved on, focusing on newer cases. The file on Lena's murder was quietly moved to the back of Doyle's desk, collecting dust. And with each day that passed, the likelihood of solving it seemed to shrink. But for Maya and Doyle, the feeling of unfinished business never went away. Every year, on the anniversary of Lena's death, Maya would visit the cemetery where Lena was buried, sitting in silence next to her grave. She spoke to her sister as though she could hear her, asking the questions that still burned inside her, hoping for an answer. But the silence was deafening. Why did this happen to you, Lena? Why couldn't I protect you? Maya would whisper, her voice trembling. Maya's life had become consumed by Lena's murder. She couldn't focus on anything else. She stopped looking for work, no longer involved in the community. The once vibrant woman had become a shadow of her former self. Every day, she lived with the pain of not knowing why her sister had to die and who had taken her from her. As for Crescent Grove, life moved on. The town's residents, who once rallied around the case, now carried on with their lives. They had jobs to worry about, children to raise, and bills to pay. The murder of Lena Rivers had become just another tragedy in the town's history, one that had faded from public memory. Most people couldn't even remember the exact details of the case anymore. There were murmurs about it from time to time, but nothing substantial. When Detective Doyle stopped by the local diner for coffee, no one mentioned Lena. When he ran into people in town, the topic of the cold case never came up. It was as if the town had collectively decided to move on. Some townspeople had long ago accepted that the killer would never be found. After all, this was a small town. It was supposed to be safe. How could something so brutal happen in a place like this? Some whispered that maybe it wasn't such a big deal after all. Maybe Lena had just been in the wrong place at the wrong time. The painful truth was that for most of Crescent Grove, the case was no longer a priority. Despite the growing apathy around her, Maya refused to give up. She called Detective Doyle every few months, her voice always holding a spark of hope. But even she could feel the change in his tone. He was weary. He was trying to let go just like everyone else. But she couldn't. She wouldn't. She started a small online petition, hoping that someone out there might remember something important. She pushed local news outlets to revisit the story, hoping for a renewed sense of urgency. She even considered hiring a private investigator, though the cost was beyond her means. The years had stolen so much from her, but she clung to one thing, the belief that justice was still possible. And somewhere deep inside, Doyle held on to that same hope. He couldn't bear the thought that Lena's case would be the one that got away. He couldn't let that be his legacy. By 2019, the case of Lena Rivers had almost become a forgotten tragedy. The investigators had run out of leads and the town, once consumed with grief, had returned to its normal rhythms. But in the world of forensic science, things were changing. And in an unexpected turn, it would be the advent of a new technology that would finally breathe life back into the cold case that had haunted Crescent Grove for over a decade. It was Detective Marcus Doyle who first received the call about the new possibility. One morning in April, nearly 14 years after Lena's murder, he sat at his desk reviewing the case files once again, hoping something would stand out. When his phone rang, he wasn't expecting much, just another routine update about the cold cases stacking up in his inbox. But this time, the voice on the other end of the line carried a sense of urgency. We've got something. A new method, genetic genealogy. We're going to try it on the evidence from Lena Rivers' case. The lab had been re-examining some of the old DNA evidence that had been collected from the crime scene. They had been using traditional methods before, but now, with the advancement of genetic genealogy, there was a new chance. By comparing the DNA from the crime scene to public genealogy databases, forensic scientists could trace distant relatives and possibly identify the suspect, even if that person had never been in a criminal database before. For Detective Doyle, this was both a ray of hope and a reminder of how far the case had fallen. How had it come to this? The technology had evolved far past anything anyone could have imagined when Lena was murdered, and yet here he was, still struggling to piece together a case that had all but been forgotten. The forensic team worked quickly. They took the DNA samples that had been collected from Lena's body, traces left behind in the form of hair follicles, skin cells, and saliva, carefully preserved in evidence bags that had sat untouched for years. Geneticists meticulously compared these samples to a growing database of individuals who had voluntarily submitted their DNA, mostly for ancestry research. The idea was simple. If a relative of the killer had submitted their genetic data to one of these public databases, the system could potentially flag a match. It was a waiting game, one that required a lot of patience and precision. But as the days passed, the breakthrough they had been waiting for came. A distant relative of the murderer was identified. The genetic trail led investigators to a name, Eric Thompson, and a family history that stretched back over several generations. Eric Thompson, who had once lived in Crescent Grove, had been in his late 20s when Lena was killed. He was now in his 40s with a family of his own and an otherwise clean record. The arrest of Eric Thompson was as shocking as it was swift. When authorities finally tracked him down and confronted him, he initially denied any involvement in Lena's death. But the evidence, however indirect, was too overwhelming to ignore. The DNA match was undeniable. Eric's cousin had unknowingly provided the key to solving the case. When the news broke, the town of Crescent Grove went into a state of disbelief. The name Eric Thompson didn't mean anything to most of the residents. He had been a quiet, inconspicuous young man who had moved away years ago. Some people remembered him as a local high school student, but no one suspected him of being capable of such a heinous crime. Lena Rivers, Lena's sister, was in shock when she heard the name. Her hands trembled as she sat in front of her television, watching the live broadcast of the arrest. She had never imagined that the person who had stolen her sister's life could have been someone so distant, someone who had slipped through the cracks for so many years. This can't be real, Maya whispered to herself, her heart pounding in her chest. The sense of betrayal she felt was palpable. A quiet part of her had always believed the killer was someone they knew, someone who had been around them all along. But now the reality was even more bizarre. A stranger whose distant family ties had never even crossed their minds. The arrest sent shockwaves through Crescent Grove. Many residents were stunned. Some had even begun to believe that the case would never be solved, that Lena's murder would remain a sad chapter in the town's history. But now, with the revelation that Eric Thompson was the suspect, the entire community was forced to confront a painful truth. The killer had been among them all along in some form, whether they knew it or not. The reactions from the townspeople varied from disbelief to anger. Some wondered how someone like Eric, who had been a quiet, unassuming figure, could have committed such a brutal crime. Others questioned how his DNA had remained so close, yet so far from being discovered. For Detective Doyle, the breakthrough was a bitter victory. He had spent years chasing shadows, trying to put together pieces of a puzzle that seemed impossible to solve. And now, with the DNA evidence in hand, the puzzle had finally come together, but not without consequences. Is this what it's like to solve a cold case? He thought as he stared at the arrest footage of Eric Thompson. To get an answer, but at what cost? The community of Crescent Grove had been living under the shadow of Lena's death for so long, and now, it had to come to terms with the fact that the man responsible was someone who had once walked among them. The pain of the revelation would not be easily forgotten. But for Lena Rivers, for Detective Doyle, and for Lena's family, this was the moment they had been waiting for, the moment justice could finally be served. The name Eric Thompson had come as a shock to everyone in Crescent Grove. It was a name no one had expected. A man with no criminal history, no records, and no connections to the case until now. But as the DNA evidence pointed to him, the investigation took a sharp turn. For Detective Marcus Doyle, the breakthrough was both a relief and a new challenge. He had finally found a lead, but now he had to figure out how it all fit together. Why had Eric killed Lena Rivers? And how had he managed to avoid suspicion for so long? Eric had grown up in Crescent Grove, a town where everyone seemed to know everyone else, yet Eric had always managed to remain just outside the spotlight. A quiet teenager with a reputation for being a bit of a loner, he hadn't been involved in any notable incidents during his youth. He was the type of person you might pass on the street and never give a second thought to. A high school graduate, Eric had gone off to college in San Francisco where he studied business. After graduation, he moved away and no one really knew much about his life after he left. Detective Doyle, however, had to know everything. He dug deep into Eric's history, sifting through old school records, contacting former classmates, and speaking to people who had known him as a child. What he found painted a picture of someone who had been more complicated than he appeared. Eric had never been close to his family. His father, John Thompson, had been a troubled man, often in and out of prison for minor offenses, and his mother, Helen Thompson, had struggled with her own demons. Eric had grown up in a fractured household, one that lacked the stability most children took for granted. Yet, despite this, there was no indication that his upbringing could have led to the violent act he had committed years later. It was only after examining Eric's early life further that Doyle discovered something chilling. Eric's family had once lived on Cypress Lane, the very street where Lena had been found dead in her home. The two had lived mere blocks apart, although they had never been acquainted. This revelation sent a chill down Doyle's spine. Could their paths have crossed? Had Eric been a familiar face in the neighborhood, watching Lena from the shadows all along? As Detective Doyle continued his investigation, he found something even more unsettling. Eric Thompson had been a former student of Lena Rivers. But not just any student. He had been one of her brightest pupils in high school, a young man whose potential had impressed her greatly. She had even recommended him for a scholarship at San Francisco University, one of the few teachers who had taken a personal interest in his future. Could this be the key? Was it possible that a bond formed in the classroom had somehow led to violence years later? Doyle's mind raced with possibilities. There were no reports of Eric having any issues with Lena during his time in school, but could there have been something deeper, something buried beneath the surface? Doyle called in Janet Harrow, a former colleague of Lena's who had worked with her at Crescent Grove High. Janet had taught alongside Lena for years and had always admired her dedication. When Doyle mentioned Eric Thompson's name, Janet's face contorted with surprise. "I remember him," Janet said, her voice soft but tinged with something that sounded almost like guilt. Eric was a quiet kid, but Lena really believed in him. She saw a lot of potential in him. But after he graduated, he just disappeared. Never came back to visit, never sent a thank you note. Lena always thought he'd do great things. She was so proud of him. This only deepened the mystery. If Lena had trusted Eric, believed in his potential, why had he turned against her? And why had he killed her so violently? As the days went on, Detective Doyle became more and more fixated on Eric Thompson. He was no longer just a suspect, he was the key to unlocking the entire case. But the questions grew more pressing. Why did Eric leave Crescent Grove? What was his life like after he moved to San Francisco? How had his life led him to murder Lena Rivers? Doyle sent out a request to the San Francisco Police Department to gather any information they could on Eric's time living there. A search of his employment records, interviews with his past roommates, and even his social media accounts revealed a man who had remained largely disconnected from everyone, isolated from the world around him. No friends, no lasting relationships. He had kept to himself, living in a modest apartment and working at a small tech startup. There were no signs of any violent tendencies, at least not on the surface. But when Doyle pressed further into Eric's personal life, he found a disturbing pattern. Eric had been struggling with deep mental health issues for years. He had seen therapists on and off, though he had stopped attending sessions long before Lena's murder. He had been diagnosed with depression and anger issues, but nothing that would have raised any alarms. Still, the more Doyle uncovered about Eric's mental health, the more questions arose. Had Eric's troubles been the catalyst for the violence that took Lena's life? Was it possible that one bad moment, one snap in his mind, had led to him taking the life of the woman who had once believed in him? As the investigation into Eric's past grew deeper, a new lead emerged, one that would soon take the case into an even darker direction. A former roommate of Eric's, Paul Harper, came forward after hearing about the breakthrough in the case. Paul, who had lived with Eric for a brief time in San Francisco, told a chilling story. Eric was different, Paul said in his interview with detectives. He was quiet, sure. But he had this look in his eyes sometimes, like he was lost. I remember once he talked about how he thought people weren't really seeing him, like he was invisible to everyone. I just thought he was going through a phase, but looking back, there was something off about him. Was this the key to understanding what had happened? Had Eric been driven by some deep-seated need for recognition, for acknowledgement from Lena, his old teacher, the one person who had believed in him? Could this feeling of being overlooked have been what ultimately led him to take Lena's life in the most violent way? The more Detective Marcus Doyle uncovered about Eric Thompson, the more he realized that the man they were pursuing was not just a suspect. He was an enigma, a puzzle that refused to fit together in any logical way. Each new piece of information seemed to deepen the mystery, revealing a man who had been consumed by shadows, driven by unseen forces, and perhaps, most terrifying of all, a person who had never truly been seen by anyone. Eric had been a quiet, isolated figure for most of his life. As a child, he had been neglected by his parents. His father, John Thompson, was a man with a violent temper, often absent due to his frequent run-ins with the law. His mother, Helen Thompson, was emotionally unavailable, struggling with her own mental health issues. It was a home built on dysfunction, where Eric was often left to fend for himself. There was no real sense of family, no emotional safety, just a constant undercurrent of neglect. As he grew older, Eric's isolation only deepened. He had never been able to connect with others, never formed lasting friendships. People in Crescent Grove remembered him as an odd but harmless kid. He kept to himself, avoided socializing, and never seemed to participate in community events. He was known for his intelligence, but there was always something off about him, a subtle discomfort in his presence that no one could explain. In his teens, Eric had been diagnosed with clinical depression. He had undergone therapy sessions intermittently, though he had never fully embraced the treatment. His therapist described him as an enigma, someone who often seemed disconnected from his own emotions, yet carried a deep-seated anger that simmered just below the surface. The anger was something that Eric never fully expressed, keeping it bottled up until it erupted in quiet, unexpected ways. By the time he was in his early 20s, Eric had convinced himself that he was invisible. He had no close friends, no romantic relationships, and no real sense of purpose. He struggled to hold down jobs, moving from one low-paying position to another, never staying in one place for too long. In his mind, no one truly saw him. He was a ghost, drifting through life unnoticed, unimportant. Detective Doyle's investigation began to reveal a disturbing pattern in Eric's life, an internal battle with his own identity and a growing resentment toward anyone who might have looked down on him. But it wasn't until Eric's time at San Francisco University that the full extent of his mental state began to emerge. It was there, at university, that Eric first met Lena Rivers. Lena had been one of the few people who had recognized his potential, recommending him for a prestigious scholarship and offering guidance as he navigated his academic career. For most people, this would have been a moment of gratitude. But for Eric, it became something far darker. He began to fixate on Lena, her praise, her belief in him. It was as though she had become the only person who could validate his existence. But over time, that validation became twisted, morphing into an unhealthy obsession. In his mind, Lena wasn't just a teacher. She was the one person who had seen him, the one person who had the power to either lift him up or push him deeper into obscurity. But what happened when Lena's encouragement started to feel like a burden? What happened when Eric began to feel that the one person who had seen him was now moving on, recommending other students, focusing on others, leaving him behind once more? The emotional shift was subtle, but it had been growing for years, like a poison slowly spreading through his veins. Detective Doyle came across an old email exchange between Eric and Lena during his time at university. At first glance, it seemed innocuous, Lena offering guidance on his future career prospects. But a closer examination revealed something far more disturbing. Eric had written her long, rambling emails, professing his gratitude and admiration, but the tone grew increasingly obsessive as time went on. One email stood out in particular, sent a few months before Lena's murder. "I don't understand why you don't see how much I've changed. I've been working so hard and you don't even notice me anymore. It feels like everyone forgets about me, but I'm here. I'm trying, Lena. Can't you see it?" Doyle felt a chill as he read those words. The seeds of resentment were there, buried beneath layers of polite conversation. Eric's belief that he had been overlooked by the one person who had once believed in him had clearly festered into something darker. The more he read, the more Doyle began to piece together a pattern of emotional neglect, jealousy, and a growing sense of entitlement. Eric felt that Lena owed him something he could never quite articulate, but which had slowly turned into a dangerous obsession. Eric's return to Crescent Grove after graduation had been marked by an attempt to reconnect with the community, to reclaim some semblance of normalcy in his life. But beneath the surface, the anger had never dissipated. It had only grown, fueled by a sense of injustice. Lena had helped him, but she had also ignored him. She had moved on, and in his mind, that was a betrayal he could not forgive. The night of March 15, 2005, was the culmination of years of pent-up frustration. When Eric saw Lena's house, quiet and still, he saw an opportunity to confront her, to demand recognition for everything she had given him. But that moment of confrontation quickly spiraled into violence. The strangulation was personal. It was a crime of passion, one driven by the belief that Lena had failed him. In that final moment, Eric wasn't just taking her life, he was taking back the control he felt had been stolen from him over the years. Lena's belief in him, once a source of strength, had become a symbol of his worthlessness. And in a moment of madness, he silenced her forever. As Detective Doyle delved deeper into Eric's life, the pieces began to fit together. What had once seemed like an unsolvable puzzle now had a clear picture. Eric Thompson wasn't a random murderer. He was a man consumed by the need for validation, overlooked by everyone, until Lena had unknowingly become the object of his obsession. But while the investigation was advancing, Doyle felt a sense of unease. Eric Thompson wasn't just a murderer, he was a product of a broken system, a victim of his own emotional neglect, and a symbol of what could happen when mental health issues were left unaddressed. Doyle couldn't help but wonder, how many other Eric Thompsons were out there? How many others were slipping through the cracks, living in the shadows, waiting for a moment to break? The town of Crescent Grove had been living in quiet tension for years, but nothing could have prepared its residents for the sudden eruption of activity that followed Eric Thompson's arrest. The peaceful streets that had once known only gossip about small-town life were now filled with sirens, reporters, and an overwhelming sense of disbelief. It was a Tuesday morning just after 7 a.m. when the knock on Eric Thompson's door came. He had been living in San Francisco for the past few years, working a desk job at a local tech startup, far removed from the town of Crescent Grove. But that morning, everything changed. At first, Eric had no idea who was at the door. He had been groggy, barely awake, when the officers presented him with the arrest warrant. The officers, two from Crescent Grove's police department and one from the San Francisco Police Department, told him they were there in connection with an unsolved case from his past. But even as they read the charges, Eric seemed confused. He was calm, perhaps too calm, and tried to brush it off as a mistake. But as the officers entered his apartment and began to explain the case, Eric's face shifted. He went silent, his eyes darting from one officer to the other. His breathing slowed and his body stiffened. As the officers led him out of his apartment in handcuffs, the full weight of the situation finally began to sink in. The arrest was swift, methodical. No one had expected Eric to be a flight risk. His arrest was a formal procedure, a shock to everyone who knew him. The question on everyone's lips was the same: how could it be? People from his neighborhood came to the windows, murmuring to one another. Was this really the same quiet, unassuming man they had passed by every day? Was this the same person who had lived next door for so many years? In Crescent Grove, the news spread like wildfire. Phones rang off the hook, people flooded the local diner to discuss the arrest, and social media lit up with confusion and horror. Eric Thompson, the man who had lived among them, worked in their community, and been a part of their lives, was now revealed as the killer they had all feared but never expected. At the Rivers household, the news was nothing short of overwhelming. Maya Rivers, Lena's sister, had just finished her morning coffee when the call came through. At first, she thought it was some sort of mistake. But as the news outlets confirmed the arrest and details started pouring in, she couldn't believe it. Eric Thompson, the quiet, distant man she had never even thought of, was the person responsible for her sister's murder. Maya's first reaction was disbelief. "This can't be real," she whispered, pacing around her kitchen. For years, she had been haunted by the idea that Lena's killer was someone they knew, someone close to them. But never once did Eric's name cross her mind. She had seen him around, had exchanged pleasantries with him as he walked through town, had heard his name in passing, but had never thought for a second that he could be the one responsible for Lena's death. Maya felt numb. The years of waiting for justice had all led to this moment, and now that the killer was finally caught, she wasn't sure how to process it. For the first time in over a decade, there was no more uncertainty. There was no more guessing. But the questions that remained, the why and the how, were now more pressing than ever. The arrest of Eric Thompson rocked Crescent Grove to its core. Elderly residents who had lived in the town for decades were beside themselves with shock. How could it be him? "I remember him as a boy walking to school," said Mildred Ferguson, a lifelong resident. "He was always so polite, so quiet. Never caused trouble." For others in town, the arrest seemed almost too unbelievable to accept. Eric Thompson, the quiet, distant young man who had always kept to himself, was now the town's biggest villain. People gathered in the streets to discuss the news, some in disbelief, others in anger. "He was in my class. He used to sit right there at the back of the room," said Laura Sanders, a former classmate of Eric's. "I can't even begin to imagine what drove him to do something like this." In small towns like Crescent Grove, people didn't just know each other, they knew their families, their histories, their patterns. The realization that someone from within their own ranks could be a murderer left a lingering, uncomfortable unease in the air. People couldn't help but wonder if they had ever crossed paths with Eric in a way that could have given them a clue to his true nature. Had they missed something? Had there been signs they ignored? The emotional toll of the arrest was felt most profoundly by Detective Marcus Doyle. After years of chasing shadows and dead ends, he had finally uncovered the truth. But as he watched Eric Thompson being led into custody, Doyle felt a sinking pit in his stomach. He had solved the case, but at what cost? For years he had questioned every lead, every witness statement, every scrap of evidence. The breakthrough that had finally solved the case was bittersweet. Eric Thompson wasn't a faceless suspect. He wasn't some stranger from out of town. He was part of the fabric of Crescent Grove, someone the community had trusted. And now that trust had been shattered. As Doyle stood there watching Eric's arrest, he couldn't shake the feeling that this case was different. It wasn't just about bringing a criminal to justice, it was about confronting the truth about how a person could hide in plain sight for so long. How could someone who seemed so unremarkable, so ordinary, turn out to be capable of such unspeakable violence? In the days following the arrest, Maya demanded to see Eric Thompson face to face. She wanted to know why Lena? Why her family? What had driven him to take her sister's life after all these years? The confrontation, though painful, was something she felt she had to do. When Maya finally sat across from Eric in the interrogation room, she looked at him with a mixture of fury and disbelief. She had always imagined the killer to be someone with anger in their eyes, someone who had a clear reason for their actions. But as she stared at Eric, silent, subdued, his eyes vacant, she felt nothing but a deep, gnawing emptiness. Eric didn't speak. He didn't explain himself. He didn't apologize. His silence was more deafening than any words could have been. The arrest of Eric Thompson had sent shockwaves through Crescent Grove, but as Detective Marcus Doyle continued to dig into the suspect's past, a darker and more twisted story began to unfold. Eric wasn't just the quiet, distant man the town had known. Beneath the surface there were secrets. Secrets that spoke of a life built on lies, manipulation, and a deep-seated rage that no one had ever seen. Eric had grown up in Crescent Grove in a household marred by dysfunction. His father, John Thompson, was an alcoholic, prone to fits of rage and occasional violence. His mother, Helen Thompson, struggled with her own demons, battling depression and anxiety that left her emotionally distant. Eric's early years were filled with neglect, both physical and emotional. John Thompson's temper was notorious in the small town. Neighbors had whispered about his frequent outbursts, but it was only those closest to the Thompsons who truly understood the severity of the situation. Eric had grown up in a home where shouting was commonplace, and physical punishment was not uncommon. His father's volatile nature made him unpredictable. At one moment he could be a loving parent and the next he would lash out in anger. Eric's mother was no better. Although she didn't physically harm Eric, her emotional neglect left him feeling invisible and abandoned. She was often too consumed with her own issues to notice the turmoil her son was enduring. Eric's cries for attention were unheard, and as he grew older, his loneliness deepened. As Eric entered his teenage years, the emotional scars of his childhood began to take their toll. He was an outsider both in his family and in school. He never quite fit in with the other kids. He was quiet, withdrawn, and often the target of teasing. But what the other kids didn't know was that Eric's mind was filled with thoughts of vengeance, of how he could escape the crushing weight of his family's dysfunction. He sought solace in books, in his studies, in the things that allowed him to escape his home life. Yet, despite his academic success, Eric felt completely alone. He never made real friends. He kept to himself, keeping his thoughts bottled up, never allowing anyone to see the depth of his isolation. But as much as Eric craved attention, he also feared it. He was terrified of being noticed, of drawing the attention of his father's temper or his mother's indifference. So, he retreated deeper into himself, hiding the rage that brewed beneath his calm exterior. When Eric arrived at Crescent Grove High, he was a withdrawn, lonely teenager. He had no friends and kept his distance from everyone. But then Lena Rivers, his high school English teacher, took notice of him. She was the first person in his life who had ever seen potential in him, and her belief in him was something that Eric couldn't ignore. For Eric, Lena's encouragement was a lifeline. She praised his academic achievements, offering him guidance that he had never received at home. Lena recommended him for scholarships, wrote glowing letters of recommendation, and became the one adult figure who seemed to care about his future. But what Lena couldn't have known was that her kindness, her belief in him, was the very thing that would lead to his downfall. Eric's admiration for Lena soon became obsession. He couldn't understand why she had chosen to invest so much in him, why she had taken the time to help him when no one else had. For Eric, it was more than a teacher-student relationship. It was validation. Lena was the only person who had ever made him feel seen, and the idea of losing that validation, of being ignored once again, became unbearable. Over time, Eric's feelings for Lena grew more intense, more suffocating. He began to view her as the only person who could give his life meaning. He thought about her constantly, fantasizing about a relationship that could never exist. But as his obsession deepened, his behavior became more erratic. He started to believe that if Lena truly cared about him, she would see his potential and give him even more of her attention. When he left Crescent Grove for San Francisco University, his obsession didn't end. It grew. Eric would send Lena long, rambling emails, expressing his gratitude but also his growing frustration. He felt she was slipping away from him, that she had forgotten him in the same way everyone else had. He wanted more. He believed that he deserved more. The emails became darker. In them, Eric didn't just thank Lena for her guidance. He demanded more from her. He wanted her attention, her recognition. And when it became clear that Lena had moved on, that she was no longer focused on him, Eric's feelings turned to resentment. In one email sent a few months before the murder, Eric wrote, "I've done everything you've asked. I've worked hard, I've proven myself. But why do you still ignore me? Why does it feel like I'm invisible to you? I need you to see me, Lena. I can't keep going on like this, being nothing to everyone." Eric's mental state deteriorated further in the years leading up to Lena's murder. Despite his outward success in school and later in his career, his inner world was crumbling. His depression and feelings of worthlessness only grew as he realized that Lena, the one person who had truly seen him, was slipping away from him, just like everyone else in his life had. At some point, Eric's emotions became a dangerous mix of love, anger, and entitlement. He felt that Lena had an obligation to him, that she owed him something for all the years he had spent in the shadows of his life. And when she no longer gave him the attention he craved, he felt betrayed, just as he had been betrayed by his family and by everyone else in his life. It was on March 15, 2005, that Eric finally snapped. The murder of Lena was no longer a random act of violence. It was the culmination of years of emotional neglect, obsession, and anger. When he arrived at Lena's home that night, it wasn't just to confront her. It was to reclaim what he felt was his due. He had been ignored for far too long, and now, he would make her see him in the only way he knew how, with force. Eric strangled Lena in a moment of blind rage, but it wasn't just an act of violence. It was an attempt to force her to acknowledge him. In his twisted mind, killing her was the only way he could make her recognize his pain, his struggle. The arrest of Eric Thompson had shaken the foundations of Crescent Grove. The small town, once a peaceful haven, was now thrust into the harsh spotlight of the criminal justice system. The murder of Lena Rivers, a case that had been cold for over a decade, had finally found its resolution. But at what cost? The upcoming trial would be the moment of reckoning for Eric Thompson, but it was also a moment for the town, for the Rivers family, and for everyone involved, to confront the brutal truth behind the crime. The town was divided. On one hand, there were those who believed justice had finally been served. After years of living under the shadow of the unsolved case, they felt a sense of closure. But for others, the reality of the situation was harder to grasp. Eric Thompson was a man many had known, someone who had been part of the community, someone who had lived among them and then vanished from view. The realization that this man was capable of such violence was hard to accept. Local news stations were filled with updates, experts discussing the psychology of the crime, the reasons behind it, and the implications of Eric's mental health. But amid all the media frenzy, the Rivers family remained in the background, silently struggling to make sense of what had happened. The trial began on a chilly morning in December 2020, nearly 15 years after Lena Rivers' murder. The courthouse in Crescent Grove was packed with spectators, the air thick with anticipation. The victim's family, the town's residents, and the press filled the seats, eager to hear the details of what had driven Eric Thompson to kill a woman who had once believed in him. In the first few days of testimony, it became clear that this trial would be anything but simple. Eric Thompson's defense team sought to argue that their client was not entirely responsible for his actions. They cited his troubled childhood, his struggles with mental illness, and his inability to understand the full consequences of his actions. They tried to paint a picture of a man who had been neglected and misunderstood his entire life, and who, in a moment of emotional breakdown, had lashed out at the one person who had ever shown him kindness. But the prosecution was equally determined to make sure that Eric was held fully accountable for his actions. They emphasized the premeditated nature of the crime, pointing to the emails and letters Eric had sent to Lena Rivers, filled with obsessive, angry words. They brought in psychologists who testified that Eric's mental health issues did not absolve him of his responsibility for the crime. In the end, it wasn't just about his past, it was about his choice to murder Lena, to take her life, to silence her in a brutal and violent act. For Maya Rivers, the trial was the hardest thing she had ever done. She had spent years fighting for justice, hoping for the day when Lena's killer would be brought to justice. But now that day had arrived, and the reality of it was far more painful than she had imagined. The first time Maya saw Eric Thompson in the courtroom, it felt like a punch to the gut. He was sitting in the defendant's chair, shackled and subdued. He looked nothing like the man she had once imagined. Gone were the dark, brooding eyes that she had conjured up in her mind. In front of her now sat a man whose face was tired, worn, and almost childlike. The monster she had imagined was replaced with someone who looked like a broken man. Maya's emotions were conflicted. Anger, betrayal, and deep sadness swirled within her. She had wanted answers for so long, but seeing Eric in person only brought more questions. What had led him to this point? Had her sister's belief in him really been the catalyst for his violence? And if so, could Lena have ever imagined the consequences of her kindness? Throughout the trial, Tom Rivers, Lena's husband, sat quietly, his eyes fixed on the proceedings, but his mind clearly somewhere else. The years of grief had worn him down, and now, as the trial unfolded, he was numb to the process. His mind often wandered back to the last time he had seen Lena alive, how she had kissed him goodbye, the last words she had said to him before he left for his business trip. Tom had spent so many years in pain, replaying the night of Lena's death over and over in his head, wondering if there was something he could have done differently. But now, with the trial in full swing, he was forced to relive those haunting moments again. The defense attempted to play on Tom's emotions, painting him as a grieving husband who had been left in the dark about his wife's death. But Maya, who had been the loudest voice calling for justice, refused to let the defense off so easily. She took to the stand herself, giving a heart-wrenching testimony about her sister's life, about the woman Lena had been, and the person she had become after Lena's death. "I will never forgive him for what he did to my sister," Maya said through her tears, staring directly at Eric. "He didn't just take her life, he took a part of all of us with her." As the trial continued, the town of Crescent Grove remained captivated by every detail. People lined up outside the courthouse hoping to catch a glimpse of the trial, hoping for answers. The case, once just another unsolved mystery, had now become the town's obsession. The media coverage was relentless, with reporters from all over the country covering the trial, each one trying to find the angle that would make their story stand out. For Detective Doyle, the public spectacle of the trial felt almost surreal. He had been involved in every step of the investigation, but now, watching it unfold in front of the world, it was hard to believe this was the same case. The case that had haunted him for so many years was now the focus of everyone's attention. And as the trial progressed, the question that remained was no longer just about Eric Thompson's guilt. It was about whether the justice system could truly give closure to a community that had lived in limbo for so long. The final days of the trial were filled with intense emotional outbursts. The closing arguments were a final opportunity for both sides to present their cases in full, but as the prosecution spoke, it was clear that they were pushing for the maximum penalty: life in prison without parole. The defense, on the other hand, begged for leniency, citing Eric's troubled childhood, his mental health struggles, and his remorse. But despite their best efforts, the jury was left with one undeniable truth: Eric had taken Lena Rivers' life. There was no excuse for the brutal murder, and no amount of psychological reasoning could erase the fact that he had killed an innocent woman, a woman who had trusted him, believed in him, and helped him in ways no one else ever had. The verdict was in. After months of tension, public scrutiny, and emotional testimony, the jury had deliberated. The room was heavy with anticipation as the judge stood, ready to announce the decision that would bring a long-awaited conclusion to the case of Lena Rivers' murder. The town of Crescent Grove, which had held its collective breath since the arrest of Eric Thompson, was about to receive the closure it had longed for, and so was Maya Rivers, who had waited for justice for over a decade. As the judge read the jury's decision, the courtroom was silent. The eyes of Maya Rivers, Tom Rivers, and everyone else present were fixed on the defendant, Eric Thompson, who sat motionless, his face a mask of exhaustion. "We, the jury, find the defendant Eric Thompson guilty of first-degree murder," the judge said, his voice cutting through the tension. The sentence will be life in prison without the possibility of parole. Maya's heart stopped. She didn't know what to feel: relief, anger, disbelief. She had spent years imagining this moment, but now that it had come, it felt surreal. As the weight of the words hit her, she felt her knees buckle, but she stayed strong. She had done it. She had fought for her sister's justice, and now, finally, it had been served. After the verdict was read, Maya stood in the middle of the courtroom, her eyes fixed on Eric Thompson. She had spent years haunted by his silence, the empty questions, the absence of answers. Now, seeing him finally held accountable, she realized how much her life had been shaped by Lena's death. The closure was bittersweet. No amount of time or verdict could bring Lena back, but now at least her sister's killer would be locked away, never to hurt anyone again. The journey had been long and painful, but Maya could finally begin to heal. As she exited the courthouse, she was met with a wave of reporters, eager for a soundbite, but all Maya wanted was to be alone. She had won the battle, but the wounds would take much longer to heal. I feel like I can finally breathe," Maya whispered to herself. "But I don't know how to let go. I don't know how to live without her." For Detective Marcus Doyle, the verdict was a sigh of relief, but it came with a heavy heart. He had spent years chasing shadows, trying to put the pieces of the puzzle together. Now, with the case finally solved, he found himself at a crossroads. Doyle had solved many cases in his career, but none had weighed on him like Lena Rivers. None had left such a mark on his soul. As he sat in his office, staring at the case file, he thought about the journey he had been on. There were moments when he had nearly given up, when the pain of the unsolved mystery had been too much to bear. But through it all, he had never given up on the people who had depended on him, especially Maya Rivers. The case had been personal for Doyle, not because he knew Eric Thompson, but because he had come to understand the deep emotional scars that had been left on the Rivers family. It wasn't just about solving a murder, it was about giving people the chance to heal. And now, with the trial over, Doyle was finally able to let go. Justice was served, he thought as he closed the file for the last time. But as much as the case was closed, he knew that the real work, the healing, was just beginning. The town of Crescent Grove had been through a lot. In the years since Lena's murder, they had witnessed the unraveling of a community's peace, the long struggle for answers, and the eventual revelation of a killer who had once lived among them. The arrest of Eric Thompson had shaken the town, but the verdict provided a sense of finality. People who had once whispered about the crime could now speak openly. There was no more fear, no more wondering who had done it. It was over. Yet for many, the town would never be the same. There was a sense of reluctant peace, but it came at a high cost. No one would ever forget the horror that had once lurked in their midst, in the very place they called home. The memories of Lena, her laughter, her warmth, would live on in the hearts of those who knew her. But the town was determined to move forward, to rebuild, and to remember. As the weeks passed, Maya began the slow process of healing. The verdict had brought closure, but the emotional scars of losing Lena would take years to fade. She moved back into her home, a place that once held nothing but grief and confusion. Now, it was a sanctuary where she could finally grieve properly, without the constant fear of the unknown hanging over her. Maya took a small step forward by attending a support group for families who had lost loved ones to violent crime. She met other people who understood her pain, who had lived through the same heartache. For the first time in years, Maya felt like she wasn't alone. The path to healing would be long, but it was a path she was finally ready to walk. Though Lena was gone, her legacy lived on. Crescent Grove High renamed a classroom in her honor, dedicating it to the teacher who had inspired so many students over the years. In the months that followed, more and more students came forward to share their stories about how Lena Rivers had touched their lives, how she had believed in them when no one else did. Her impact was far-reaching, a legacy of kindness and compassion that would never be forgotten. Maya found comfort in the knowledge that Lena had made a difference, that her life had mattered. In the end, that was the most important thing. The verdict had brought justice, but Lena's true legacy would live on in the hearts of those she had helped.